Ethan Carter walked out of the Human Resources office, holding a small cardboard box against his chest. 10 minutes earlier, he had been an employee with 12 years of loyal service behind him. Now a security guard walked beside him as though he were a common thief being marched out of a building he had helped build with his own hands. The open floor of the office watched in silence, some faces amused, some faces indifferent, as Ryan Cole folded his arms and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, that a useless man like Ethan should have been fired a long time ago. Ethan said nothing. He set the box down on the reception counter, pulled out his phone, and made exactly one call. 30 seconds later, every phone belonging to the senior leadership team began ringing at once, and the color drained from their faces in an instant. Ethan arrived at the office before 6 every morning, long before the parking lot filled, and long before the coffee machine in the break room finished its first cycle. He liked the quiet of those early hours, the hum of the servers, the low light through the glass walls, the sense that the whole building still belonged, briefly, only to him. He used that time to check the overnight logs, to read through client complaints nobody else wanted to touch, and to fix small errors before they became large ones. When the systems crashed one Tuesday morning, taking down the entire order processing platform 2 hours before a major client call, it was Ethan who found the corrupted server file. Ethan who rewrote the failing script, and Ethan who brought everything back online before most of his colleagues had even poured their first cup of coffee. By the time Ryan Cole walked into the office that morning, the crisis was already over. Ryan listened to the relieved chatter of the sales floor, learned the numbers were saved, and within the hour, was standing in front of Victoria Bennett describing, in vivid detail, how his quick thinking under pressure had rescued the company from disaster. Nobody corrected him. The engineers who had watched Ethan work through the night stayed quiet, because correcting Ryan Cole in front of the chief executive was not a habit that kept a person employed for long. Ethan heard the story secondhand later that afternoon, standing near the printer, and he simply nodded and went back to his desk. He had learned, over many years, that some battles were not worth the noise they created. Linda Brooks, the director of Human Resources, had her own methods of shaping the story that reached the top floor. She kept a file on every employee, official documents mixed quietly with private notes that rarely reflected reality. And Ethan's file had grown thick with vague complaints that never quite named a source, missed deadlines that were never missed, difficult attitude that no one who worked beside him had ever witnessed, poor collaboration, despite the fact that half the department relied on him to solve the problems no one else wanted to touch. Linda smiled at Ethan every time she passed him in the hallway, asked about his weekend, complimented his tie, and then returned to her office and added another line to a file designed to end his career the moment it was convenient. Ethan noticed all of it. He noticed the falsified expense reports that Ryan filed every quarter, the inflated sales figures that never matched the client contracts, the subtle threats Linda used to keep junior staff from speaking up in meetings. He said nothing to anyone above him, not because he lacked the courage, but because he was waiting, patiently, for the person at the very top to see it for herself. Victoria Bennett had been appointed chief executive 8 months earlier, brilliant and fair by every account, but she was still new enough to the building's politics that she trusted the reports placed neatly on her desk each Friday without questioning who had written them or what they left out. Ethan understood that trust was a young executive's greatest strength and, in the wrong hands, her greatest weakness. Victoria's appearances on the operations floor were rare, brief, and carefully managed by the people around her. She reviewed dashboards full of green arrows and rising percentages. She nodded through presentations that praised Ryan's leadership and Linda's culture initiatives, and she signed off on decisions that had already been made long before they reached her desk. She had no reason to suspect that the numbers she admired were built on borrowed credit and quiet manipulation. When the company posted an unexpected multi-million-dollar loss that quarter, the executive floor scrambled to explain it. And Ryan Cole, sensing danger to his own position, understood exactly who could be sacrificed to make the problem disappear. A quiet man, with no titles and no allies, was the easiest story to tell. There had been other moments over the years when Ethan could have ended the charade with a single sentence, moments when a quiet word from him would have unraveled Ryan's carefully constructed reputation in an instant. He chose, again and again, to hold his tongue, telling himself that a company built on real values should be able to correct itself from within. That a good leader, given enough time and enough evidence, would eventually see clearly. He watched junior employees transfer out of the operations department in quiet frustration. Watched talented people quit rather than continue working under a culture that rewarded flattery over honesty, and each departure weighed on him a little more heavily than the last. Still, he waited, patient in the particular way only a man who already owned the outcome could afford to be. Late one afternoon, a message arrived on Ethan's desk phone, asking him to come up to the Human Resources office as soon as possible. He read the message twice, set down the report he had been reviewing, and walked toward the elevator without any particular urgency in his step, as though he already understood exactly what waited for him on the other side of that door. Linda Brooks did not waste time on pleasantries. The moment Ethan stepped into her office, she slid a single sheet of paper across the desk and told him, in a flat and practiced voice, that his employment was being terminated effective immediately. She listed reasons that sounded rehearsed rather than true, citing performance concerns that had never once been raised with him directly. And when Ethan opened his mouth to ask a question, she raised a hand and told him there was nothing further to discuss. His employee badge was deactivated before he had even finished reading the letter. The little green light on the card reader turning red the instant Linda tapped a few keys on her computer. 2 security guards were waiting just outside the door, summoned in advance, as though the company had anticipated some kind of resistance from a man who had never raised his voice in 12 years. They walked him across the open floor at a measured pace, past desks where colleagues pretended to work while stealing glances over their monitors, past the break room where someone was already recording the scene on a phone, capturing every second for reasons that had nothing to do with sympathy. Ryan Cole stood near the elevator bank, arms crossed, laughing loudly enough that the sound carried across the entire floor, savoring a victory he believed had cost him nothing at all. Ethan stopped at the door and turned back once, looking directly at Ryan. He asked, in a voice so calm it unsettled the few people close enough to hear it, whether this was truly the final decision. Ryan grinned and told him he was nothing, that he had never been anything, and that the company would forget his name within a week. Ethan simply nodded, said the word okay, and walked through the glass doors into the parking lot without another word, leaving behind 12 years of quiet devotion, folded into a small cardboard box that the guard had refused to let him carry properly. He sat in his car for a long moment before starting the engine, the cardboard box resting on the passenger seat beside him, sunlight cutting sharp lines across the dashboard. He did not cry, and he did not slam his hands against the steering wheel the way a lesser man might have. He simply reached for his phone, scrolled to a single contact near the top of his list, and pressed call. The person on the other end answered on the second ring, and Ethan spoke only 2 words, quiet and unhurried, the kind of voice a man uses when he has waited years for a moment and finally allows himself to reach for it. Begin now. There was no shouting in his tone, no trace of anger, no need to explain what had happened or why. The voice on the other end did not ask a single question. It simply said, "Yes, sir." And the call ended less than 10 seconds after it began. What followed happened with a speed that would have terrified anyone who understood what was actually unfolding behind the scenes. Within minutes, the chairman of the board received an encrypted message and immediately called an emergency session, canceling 3 unrelated meetings without explanation. The legal department received instructions to freeze specific personnel files and preserve every email, message, and financial record connected to the operations division going back 6 months. An independent auditing firm, already on retainer for exactly this kind of contingency, was activated and told to begin a comprehensive review before the end of the business day. The company's largest institutional investors received a brief, carefully worded notice that a material internal matter required their immediate attention. None of this reached the operations floor, where Ryan Cole continued to bask in the satisfaction of a job he believed was well done. He assumed, in the smug and untested confidence of a man who had never been tested, that Ethan's phone call was nothing more than a bitter, empty gesture, the kind of thing a powerless man does to feel powerful for 30 seconds before returning to whatever quiet, forgettable life awaited him. He told a colleague near the coffee station that some people simply did not know how to accept the end gracefully, and he laughed again, the same laugh that had echoed across the floor less than an hour before, utterly unaware that the ground beneath him had already begun to shift. Victoria Bennett was in a client meeting when her assistant slipped a note across the table, interrupting a presentation she had spent 2 weeks preparing. The note contained only a few words, but they were enough to make her stand up immediately and apologize to the room, something she had never done in 8 months as chief executive. She was told only that the chairman required her presence in the main boardroom without delay, and that whatever she was doing could wait. Victoria walked the long hallway toward the executive floor, with a rising sense of unease she could not quite name. The kind of instinct that told her the world she thought she understood was about to look very different. When she pushed open the boardroom doors, she found a room that had never assembled this way in her tenure as chief executive. The chairman sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable, in a way that unsettled her more than any visible anger could have. Beside him sat the company's lead outside counsel, a woman Victoria had only ever seen during formal contract signings. And across from them sat 2 independent auditors she did not recognize at all, along with a representative from the firm's largest institutional investor, a man whose presence alone signaled that this was no ordinary internal matter. The air in the room felt heavier than any meeting she had ever attended, thick with a tension that seemed to press against the walls themselves. Papers were already spread across the table, folders stamped with dates going back further than Victoria's own time at the company, and no one offered her coffee or small talk the way they usually did before difficult conversations began. Ryan Cole arrived moments later, summoned by the same urgent message, and he walked in with the easy confidence of a man expecting to be commended, straightening his jacket as though preparing for a photograph rather than a reckoning. The chairman did not waste time on preliminaries. He looked around the table, his eyes settling briefly on each face, before asking a single question in a voice that carried the full weight of the room. He wanted to know who had personally signed the decision to terminate an employee named Ethan Carter that same afternoon. Ryan raised his hand almost immediately, unable to resist claiming credit even in a moment he did not yet understand was dangerous, his voice steady with the assumption that whatever came next would only add another line to his growing list of accomplishments. Victoria felt something shift in her chest, a small alarm she could not yet name. Watching the chairman's expression remain perfectly still while Ryan spoke. She had approved nothing that day beyond the reports placed in front of her each morning. And she had certainly never been consulted about the termination of an employee whose name she barely recognized. She began scanning the faces around the table, searching for some clue as to why a single dismissal, an event that happened dozens of times a year across a company this size, had summoned lawyers, auditors, and a major investor into one room within the span of an hour. The chairman let the silence stretch for a long moment before he spoke again, and this time his question landed differently, sharper, heavier, aimed less at gathering information and more at delivering a warning that only Ryan seemed too confident to hear. He asked the room, plainly and without theater, whether anyone present actually understood who they had just fired. Ryan opened his mouth to answer, some easy dismissal already forming on his lips, but the chairman raised a hand and continued before he could speak, and something in that gesture made even Ryan finally go quiet. The chairman explained, in a voice devoid of drama but heavy with consequence, that Ethan Carter was not simply an operations employee who had spent 12 years quietly filing reports and fixing broken systems. He was, in fact, one of the 2 original co-founders of the company. A man who had built its earliest infrastructure from nothing alongside the chairman himself more than 15 years earlier. Through a private trust established at the company's founding, Ethan controlled 51% of its total shares, a controlling stake that had remained deliberately hidden from the operations floor for years, known only to a small handful of people at the very top. He was also, the chairman continued, the architect of nearly every operational system the company relied upon today, the invisible framework behind the very processes Ryan had spent years claiming credit for repairing. He had been offered the position of chief executive on 3 separate occasions and had turned it down each time, choosing instead to remain close to the ground floor, working quietly among the people whose daily struggles the leadership above them rarely saw or understood. Victoria felt the room tilt slightly around her, the polished mahogany table suddenly feeling very far away, as she began to understand the scale of what had just happened beneath her own signature. Ryan let out a short, disbelieving laugh, the sound thin and nervous now rather than confident. insisting that this had to be some kind of elaborate joke designed to test the executive team's loyalty. He looked around the table for support, for someone to laugh along with him. But every face remained still and grave. And the silence that answered him was far more damning than any accusation could have been. He was still searching for an ally when the large screen at the end of the boardroom flickered to life, displaying a legal document bearing a signature dated more than 15 years earlier. The document was a certified copy of the original shareholder trust agreement, complete with notarized signatures, the company's founding charter, and a schedule of equity distribution that placed Ethan Carter's name at the very top, above every executive currently seated in that room. Beneath it appeared a second file, a formal ownership registry updated as recently as the previous quarter, confirming that nothing about his position had changed in the years since. Ryan's face lost every trace of color as he stared at the screen, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single word, the confidence that had carried him through the entire day collapsing in the space of a few seconds. The doors to the boardroom opened without a knock, and every head turned at once, drawn by an instinct that told them something irreversible was about to begin. Ethan Carter walked in wearing the same simple gray jacket he had worn that morning, no different in appearance than the man who had been escorted out of the building only hours earlier, except that now no one in the room dared to laugh. The room fell into a silence so complete that the hum of the air conditioning became suddenly audible, and no one, not even the chairman, spoke first. Ethan walked to the head of the table and stood there for a moment, unhurried, his eyes moving slowly across each face in turn, lingering just long enough on Ryan and Linda to let the weight of recognition settle fully before he said a single word. He asked, in the same measured voice he had used his entire career, for 6 months of security camera footage to be pulled from the operations floor, for the complete email archive of the executive management team, for every internal financial transaction processed through the discretionary accounts, and for the full quarterly performance reports submitted to the board over the past 2 years. His voice carried no anger, no theatrical pause for effect, only the calm precision of a man who had already known, long before this moment, exactly what those records would reveal. The evidence appeared on the screen piece by piece, each file more damaging than the last, painted in the cold, undeniable language of dates and numbers and timestamps that could not be argued with the way a story could. Ryan Cole's name surfaced first, connected to a pattern of misappropriated funds routed through vendor contracts that did not exist, along with internal messages showing him pressuring junior staff to falsify performance metrics ahead of quarterly reviews. There were records of manipulated key performance indicators, inflated by numbers quietly borrowed from other departments' unclaimed credit, and evidence of bonus payments approved for work that had, in fact, been completed entirely by someone else. Linda Brooks appeared next, her carefully maintained reputation unraveling under the weight of her own paperwork. The files revealed fabricated human resources documentation used to justify terminations that violated the company's own employment policies, complaints altered or deleted entirely when they threatened people she favored, and a pattern of covering for Ryan's misconduct that stretched back years, documented in her own handwriting across dozens of internal memos she had assumed no one would ever read again. Mark Hansen's contribution to the pattern was smaller in scale, but no less deliberate. A quieter habit of claiming the achievements of employees beneath him, particularly the very man he had spent years belittling in front of the sales team. Screenshots of internal messages showed him instructing junior staff to remove Ethan's name from client-facing reports before submission, replacing it with his own, a small daily theft repeated so often it had simply become part of how the department operated. Victoria watched each new file appear with a growing sense of horror, the picture of her own company reassembling itself into something she barely recognized. She had built her confidence in this leadership team on quarterly numbers and polished presentations, never once suspecting that the very foundation beneath those numbers had been hollowed out by the people she trusted most. Every rising chart she had praised in board meetings, every award Ryan had accepted on stage at company events, every glowing performance review Linda had signed, all of it now looked less like success and more like an elaborate performance staged specifically for her benefit. The chairman watched her expression change and said nothing, allowing the evidence itself to finish the argument he had started with a single question an hour earlier. Beyond the individual acts of theft and deception, a larger pattern began to emerge from the files. one that painted a picture far more troubling than a handful of dishonest employees acting alone. The evidence showed a system that had quietly rewarded cruelty for years. Promotions handed not to the people who solved problems, but to the people who best protected the interests of those already in power. Junior staff members who had once tried to raise concerns through proper channels found their complaints buried, their names quietly flagged as difficult, their careers stalled without any clear explanation ever given to them. Ethan had watched this machinery operate for years from the ground floor, close enough to see every gear turning. And now, for the first time, the people who had built that machinery were forced to watch it turned against them. Victoria asked, her voice barely above a whisper, how long this had been allowed to continue without anyone above intervening. The chairman answered for Ethan, explaining that the trust structure had been designed precisely to allow the company's true owner to observe without interference, to see the culture as it actually existed, rather than as it was presented in polished quarterly summaries. It was, he admitted, an imperfect system, one that had allowed real harm to accumulate before it was finally addressed. But it had also produced something no ordinary audit ever could have, an unfiltered record of exactly who the company's leadership truly was, when they believed no one important was watching. When the last file closed on the screen, the room waited for someone to offer an explanation, some defense, some plea that might soften what had just been laid bare in front of the company's most powerful people. Ryan opened his mouth once, twice, but no words came. And Linda simply stared down at the table, her hands folded tightly in her lap, as though holding herself together by force. Ethan let the silence stretch long enough for every person in the room to fully absorb what they had seen, and then he spoke only 4 words, quiet, final, and impossible to misunderstand. Fire every one of them. The instructions moved through the building faster than anyone could have anticipated, carried not by rumor but by formal directive, issued jointly by the chairman and legal counsel within minutes of leaving the boardroom. Ryan Cole, Linda Brooks, Mark Hansen, and 3 other members of the management team who had been complicit in covering for them were placed on immediate suspension, their access to every company system severed before they had even returned to their desks. Security badges deactivated with a keystroke, the same quiet mechanism that had ended Ethan's access only hours earlier, now turning against the people who had wielded it against him. Company laptops were seized and sealed for the ongoing audit. Desks were cordoned off, and personal belongings were cataloged by compliance staff, under the watchful presence of security personnel who had been briefed to expect resistance. When the guards arrived to escort Ryan from the building, he walked the same path Ethan had walked that morning, past the same desks, through the same glass doors, trailed by the same murmurs that had followed his former colleague only hours before. The symmetry was not lost on anyone who witnessed it. Word of what had happened in the boardroom spread through the building within the hour. Not through any official announcement but through the quiet, urgent whispers that travel faster than any memo ever could. People who had laughed along with Ryan that morning now stood frozen at their desks, replaying every small moment of cruelty they had witnessed or participated in over the past several years, wondering how much of it had been noticed by someone who had simply chosen not to react. A junior analyst who had once been publicly humiliated by Mark Hansen in front of an entire department meeting sat quietly at her desk, staring at nothing, unable to fully process that the man responsible might finally face consequences for it. The operations floor, usually filled with the low buzz of phone calls and keyboard clatter, fell into a silence unlike anything the building had experienced in years. No one laughed this time. No one recorded the scene on a phone for entertainment. Employees who had once nervously watched Ryan pass their desks now watched him leave for the last time. And something in the collective mood of the room shifted, a quiet, cautious sense that the ground they stood on had just become more solid than it had been that morning. Victoria remained in the boardroom long after the others had filed out, staring at the closed laptop in front of her as though it might offer an explanation she had not yet fully absorbed. When she finally looked up, she found Ethan still standing near the window, unhurried, watching the late afternoon light fall across the city skyline as though the last several hours had cost him nothing at all. She asked, quietly, whether he had a few minutes to speak with her privately, and he simply nodded and gestured toward the small conference room down the hall. Once the door closed behind them, Victoria did not waste time with careful diplomatic language. She apologized, plainly and without excuse, for the decision that had been made under her leadership even though her signature had never technically appeared on the termination letter. She told him she should have questioned the reports more carefully, should have spent more time on the operations floor instead of trusting the polished summaries delivered to her office each week, should have noticed the pattern long before it required a chairman's emergency intervention to expose it. Ethan listened without interrupting, his expression calm rather than cold, and when she finished, he told her something she had not expected to hear. He said a chief executive did not need to know everything happening inside a building this large, that no leader ever truly could, but that a chief executive did need to know how to recognize who deserved her trust and who was simply skilled at earning it falsely. Victoria felt her composure slip for the first time that day, and to her own surprise, she found herself blinking back tears in front of a man she had fired less than 8 hours earlier. It was the first time since taking the role that she truly understood how thoroughly she had been managed, not by outright deception in any single moment, but by a slow, patient shaping of everything that reached her desk, filtered and polished until the truth beneath it had become nearly invisible. She admitted quietly that she had believed herself to be a fair and attentive leader, only to discover that fairness meant very little if the information guiding her decisions had been curated by people with something to hide. Ethan told her, without any trace of bitterness, that he had once considered stepping away from the company entirely, retiring quietly to a smaller life far from boardrooms and quarterly targets. He explained that he had built this place from nothing many years ago, back when it was little more than an idea and a handful of employees working out of a converted warehouse, and that somewhere along the way, as the company grew larger and more profitable, he had begun to wonder whether the values it was founded on still meant anything to the people running it day to day. He said he had returned not to reclaim power or attention, but simply to observe, quietly and without title, whether the culture he had once poured everything into still reflected the principles that mattered to him. 12 years on the operations floor had given him an answer he had not wanted to accept, a slow accumulation of evidence that something had gone wrong long before today's collapse made it impossible to ignore any longer. Victoria studied him carefully as he spoke, seeing for the first time, not a mysterious founder revealed by dramatic circumstance, but a tired, thoughtful man who had simply wanted to know if the thing he built still mattered. She asked him, hesitantly, whether he intended to leave again now that the truth was finally out in the open, whether this strange and painful day marked the end of his quiet presence in the company rather than a new beginning. Ethan considered the question for a long moment before answering, his eyes drifting briefly toward the window and the city lights beginning to flicker on below. He told her he had no interest in taking the chief executive title for himself, that he never had, and that the company did not need another founder standing at its head issuing commands from behind a closed door. What it needed, he said, was a leader willing to rebuild the trust that had been broken, someone who understood now, in a way she could not have understood 8 months earlier, exactly how fragile that trust truly was. He believed Victoria could be that leader, provided she was willing to do the harder, slower work of tearing down what remained of the old structure and replacing it with something honest. He proposed, simply, that she remain in her position as chief executive, fully in charge, but that the entire management layer beneath her be rebuilt from the ground up, free of the political games and quiet cruelties that had defined it for years. He asked that promotions be based strictly on demonstrated ability, rather than personal loyalty to whoever happened to be sitting in power at the time, and that every employee, regardless of rank, have a real and protected channel to speak honestly, without fear of a file like the one Linda had kept on him. Victoria agreed without hesitation, relieved to have a path forward that did not require her to abandon the role she had worked so hard to earn, and grateful, in a way she found difficult to fully express, that Ethan had chosen to guide rather than replace her. Over the following weeks, the company began to change in ways employees could feel before they could fully name. Small shifts in tone during meetings, a new willingness among managers to admit uncertainty instead of performing false confidence, an unfamiliar sense that honesty was no longer a liability. New department heads were selected through a transparent process that included input from the very employees who would report to them, a practice unheard of under the previous administration. Performance reviews were rebuilt around clear, measurable criteria instead of vague impressions shaped by whoever had the most influence in a given quarter. Controlled, liariest, controlled, and the quiet fear that had defined the culture for years began to loosen its grip. The engineer who had stayed silent about Ryan taking credit for the overnight system repair was among the first to be promoted under the new structure, her contributions finally recognized without the filter of someone else's ambition standing between her work and the people who mattered. A younger sales associate, who had once watched Mark Hansen strip his name from a client report without a word of protest, was given a formal channel to document exactly what had happened. And the correction, when it came, arrived not as a favor but as a matter of simple fairness. Small moments like these accumulated across the company, each one a quiet signal that the old rules no longer applied. That competence and honesty had finally become more valuable than proximity to power. Ethan watched these changes unfold from the same modest desk he had always preferred, declining every offer to move to a larger office on the executive floor, content to remain close to the work itself rather than above it. Victoria spent far more time walking the operations floor now, learning names, listening to complaints she once would never have heard, and she often found Ethan nearby, not directing anything, but simply present, a steady reference point she found herself seeking out more and more as the weeks passed. Their conversations, which had begun as necessary discussions about restructuring and accountability, slowly expanded into something less formal, lingering a few extra minutes after meetings ended. Small observations about the day, exchanged over coffee, that neither of them seemed eager to end. Employees noticed. In the quiet way employees always notice things. A growing ease between the chief executive and the man now understood to be the company's controlling shareholder, though neither of them made any public statement about the nature of their relationship. Victoria found herself thinking about their conversations long after she left the office, replaying small moments. The particular way Ethan listened without interrupting, the dry humor that occasionally surfaced beneath his usual composure. Respect, built slowly across weeks of shared effort to rebuild something broken, had begun, without either of them fully naming it, to soften into something warmer. One evening, after a long day spent finalizing the company's new leadership framework, Victoria asked Ethan if he would like to have dinner with her. Away from the office, away from spreadsheets and personnel files, and the lingering weight of everything that had happened, he accepted without hesitation. And over a quiet meal at a small restaurant neither of them had visited before, they spoke of things that had nothing to do with the company at all. Old memories, small regrets, the particular loneliness of building something meaningful and having no one to share it with. A year passed. And the company that had nearly collapsed under the weight of hidden corruption now stood as one of the most respected in its industry, its revenues reaching levels the previous leadership team had only ever projected in optimistic slide decks that turned out to be fiction. Employee retention climbed steadily as word spread that this was a place where hard work was recognized honestly and where speaking the truth no longer carried the risk it once had. Industry publications began writing about the company's remarkable turnaround, praising its transparent culture and its rebuilt trust between leadership and staff, though few of them ever learned the full story behind the transformation. Competitors sent representatives to study the new performance review system, curious how a company that had nearly collapsed under scandal only a year earlier had emerged with employee satisfaction scores higher than any of its rivals. None of the articles mentioned a cardboard box or a single phone call. And Ethan preferred it that way, content to let the results speak for themselves rather than the story behind them. Ryan Cole, Linda Brooks, and Mark Hansen each faced their own consequences beyond the walls of the company, their reputations following them into an industry that talked, in the end, just as much as any office ever had. None of them found work at a comparable level again, and none of them ever learned exactly how much Ethan had known, or for how long, before the day he finally decided enough was enough. Victoria heard, secondhand, that Ryan had tried more than once to reach out to old contacts within the company, seeking some kind of reference or explanation he could offer to future employers, and each request was quietly declined by people who had once feared him and now simply had no reason to help him any further. Victoria Bennett had become, in the eyes of nearly everyone who worked for her, a chief executive worthy of genuine respect, not because she had never made mistakes, but because she had proven willing to face them honestly and rebuild what had broken beneath her. At the company's annual gala, held in a grand hall filled with employees from every level of the organization, she stood before a microphone and looked out at faces that no longer flinched when leadership walked past their desks. she spoke about the difficult year behind them, choosing her words carefully. And then she turned her attention to a man seated quietly near the back of the room, deliberately away from the spotlight he had never wanted. She told the room, her voice steady despite the emotion beneath it, that the day Ethan Carter had been fired was the day she came closer than she ever wanted to admit to losing the entire company without even realizing it was happening. Ethan rose from his seat as the room turned to look at him, and he offered a small, quiet smile before responding, his voice carrying easily across the silent hall. He told her, gently, that she was wrong. That day, he said, was not the day the company nearly fell apart. It was the day the company finally had the chance to be built again. Properly this time. On something honest enough to last. The room rose together in applause that lasted far longer than either of them expected. Employees who had once quietly recorded his humiliation now standing to honor the truth of who he had always been. When the applause finally faded and the evening began winding toward its close, Victoria found Ethan near the edge of the hall, away from the crowd, the noise of the gala fading into a soft hum behind them. She asked him, her voice quieter now, more uncertain than it had been at any point during her carefully prepared speech, whether he would be willing, this time, to begin a new chapter alongside her, not as founder and chief executive bound only by shared responsibility, but as two people who had somehow found each other in the wreckage of a very difficult year. Ethan looked at her for a long moment, the warmth in his expression unmistakable now, free of the careful restraint he had carried through so much of the story that brought them here. He smiled and nodded, a simple, quiet gesture that carried more certainty than any spoken promise could have offered. Together, they walked out of the grand hall side by side, leaving behind the applause and the lights and the story that had begun so many months earlier, with a small cardboard box and a single phone call that changed everything.